I once learned that the deepest heartbreak is not hearing someone say they hate you. It is realizing they no longer believe you deserve a place in their happiest memories. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, folded neatly inside a plain white envelope with no return address. I recognized my sister Linda's handwriting before I even opened it. She had always pressed harder with her pen than anyone else I knew, leaving faint impressions on the paper beneath every sentence. Inside was a short note, written with obvious hesitation. She explained that my son Ethan's wedding was only 3 weeks away and that invitations had finally been mailed. Then she apologized for telling me something she believed I deserved to know before hearing it from someone else. There would not be an invitation addressed to me. I read the letter twice before quietly placing it on the kitchen table beside my untouched cup of coffee. Outside, early autumn sunlight filtered through the maple trees surrounding my small home in Franklin, Tennessee. The neighborhood was waking slowly. A neighbor pushed a lawnmower across fresh grass while somewhere in the distance a dog barked happily. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, yet something inside me became impossibly quiet. I was 68 years old, retired from construction after nearly 4 decades, and had spent the last 12 years living alone after my former wife and I quietly accepted that our marriage could not survive the distance life had placed between us. Losing a marriage had been painful. Losing daily conversations with my son had been worse. Ethan was 32 now, successful, intelligent, and preparing to marry a woman named Claire. I had met her only once almost a year earlier at a charity fundraiser where she smiled warmly, shook my hand politely, and thanked me for attending. Our conversation lasted less than 5 minutes before Ethan gently guided her toward another group of guests. He introduced me simply as Richard rather than Dad. Claire never noticed. I pretended not to notice either. That had become our unspoken agreement over the years. We both avoided conversations neither of us knew how to begin. I carried the letter into the living room where an old wooden bookshelf held the few possessions that mattered most to me. Family photographs, a leather Bible with worn pages, several woodworking trophies from county fairs, and one framed picture taken when Ethan was 8 years old. In that photograph he sat proudly on my shoulders after we finished building his first treehouse together. His smile stretched from ear to ear while mine looked almost identical. Sometimes I wondered where that version of us had gone. Most people who knew our family believed they already understood the story. Years earlier I had accepted a long-term construction project several states away. The job kept me traveling for months at a time. Birthdays were missed. School concerts happened without me. Baseball games were attended by other fathers while Ethan looked toward empty seats. By the time I finally returned home permanently, resentment had quietly replaced childhood admiration. From Ethan's perspective, his father had always chosen work over family. I never argued with his conclusion because I understood why it seemed true. Explaining only half a story often creates more confusion than silence ever does. Around noon my telephone rang. Linda called to make sure I had received her letter. She apologized again, saying she struggled for days before deciding to tell me. "I thought you should hear it from someone who loves you," she whispered. I thanked her sincerely and asked about her grandchildren before changing the subject. She eventually asked the question everyone probably expected. "Are you going to call Ethan?" I looked through the living room window toward the quiet street outside before answering. "No." She sounded surprised. "Not even to ask why?" I smiled gently although she could not see it. A wedding should begin with joy, not guilt. If my son believes I should stay away, I will respect his decision. After we ended the call, I walked into the garage where the scent of freshly cut cedar still lingered from the previous week's woodworking project. Sitting on my workbench was a beautifully handcrafted walnut keepsake box I had been building for nearly 6 months. Inside rested a handwritten letter, an old pocket watch that once belonged to Ethan's grandfather, and a small envelope containing something I had protected for almost 20 years. I slowly ran my fingers across the polished wood before closing the lid once more. The gift had never depended on receiving an invitation. It depended only on the hope that one day my son might finally be ready to understand why the years we lost had never been caused by a lack of love. The days following Linda's letter passed with remarkable calm, at least on the surface. Every morning I followed the same routine that had quietly shaped my retirement. I rose before sunrise, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, read a few chapters from my old Bible, and spent several hours in the garage workshop where the scent of walnut and cedar had become as comforting as any familiar melody. Friends often asked why I still built furniture when I no longer needed the income. I always answered that working with wood reminded me of life itself. Every board carried imperfections, but with enough patience and careful hands, even the deepest flaws could become part of something beautiful. That Thursday afternoon I drove into town to purchase brass hinges for the keepsake box I intended to finish before Ethan's wedding day. The small hardware store had changed very little during the past 20 years. The same wooden floors creaked beneath every step, and the owner, Mr. Dawson, still greeted customers by name before asking what project they were working on. As he wrapped the polished hinges in brown paper, he smiled warmly. "Getting ready for the big wedding?" he asked. I returned the smile. News traveled quickly through a town the size of Franklin. "Something like that," I answered quietly. He congratulated me anyway, never realizing his simple kindness carried a small ache I preferred not to explain. After leaving the store I stopped at a neighborhood coffee shop where I occasionally spent quiet afternoons reading. As I waited for my order, the front door opened and Ethan walked inside. He was alone, dressed neatly in business clothes, speaking into his telephone about seating arrangements and floral deliveries. For a brief second I considered slipping out unnoticed. Then he looked up and saw me standing near the counter. Time seemed to pause. We had not spoken face to face in almost 6 months. Ethan ended his call, placed his telephone into his jacket pocket, and slowly walked toward me. "Hello, Richard," he said politely. The word landed exactly where I expected. Richard. Not Dad. Not Father. Simply the name of a man he happened to know. I smiled gently. "Hello, Ethan. You look well." He nodded. "Wedding planning has been busy." "I imagine it has." Another silence settled between us, not hostile, simply unfamiliar. Eventually I reached into my coat pocket and removed a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note containing nothing more than my congratulations and a gift certificate to a local furniture craftsman where Ethan and Claire could choose anything they wished for their future home. "I thought perhaps you might like this," I said, handing him the envelope. He accepted it cautiously before looking back at me. "Thank you." I nodded once. "I hope the day is everything you both dream it will be." His expression softened for just a moment before uncertainty returned. It looked as though he wanted to say something else, but another customer greeted him by name from across the cafe. The opportunity quietly disappeared. Before leaving, Ethan turned back toward me. "Claire asked about you once." That surprised me. "What did you tell her?" He hesitated. "That we were never very close." I studied his face carefully. There was no anger in his voice. Only a quiet certainty built over many years. "I understand," I answered. "Take good care of her." He nodded before walking away. I remained standing beside the window long after he left, watching autumn leaves drift across the parking lot. Sometimes people do not lie about the past. They simply describe the part they lived through. That evening, nearly 20 miles away, Claire sat at her dining table addressing final wedding invitations. As she compared names against the guest list, she frowned slightly. "Ethan," she called gently, "I noticed something." He looked up from his laptop. "What is it?" She tapped one empty line on the seating chart. "There is no place reserved for your father." Ethan quietly closed the computer. "He is not coming." Claire seemed surprised. "Was that his decision?" Ethan answered without looking at her. "No. Mine." She waited for an explanation that never came. Instead, he simply returned his attention to the wedding budget spread across the table. Claire watched him for several thoughtful moments before quietly changing the subject. Yet a small question had already taken root in her mind. During the months they had been together, she had met cousins, co-workers, neighbors, college friends, and even former teachers. Somehow the father of the man she loved remained almost entirely absent from every conversation. She remembered the brief encounter at the charity fundraiser months earlier. The older gentleman had spoken kindly, smiled warmly, and never once acted like someone carrying bitterness. As she finished sealing another invitation, she looked once more at the single empty space where his name might have been. Without realizing it, the first thread leading toward the truth had quietly begun to unravel. Over the next several days, Claire found herself noticing small details that everyone else seemed perfectly comfortable ignoring. Wedding planning filled nearly every hour of her schedule. Florists called to confirm deliveries. The church coordinator requested final seating arrangements. The photographer asked for a complete list of immediate family members so no important portraits would be forgotten. Every conversation eventually returned to the same simple question. Who belongs in the family photographs? Each time the question appeared, Ethan answered without hesitation. Just my mother, my Aunt Linda, and close relatives. Claire never argued. She simply noticed that his father disappeared from every version of the future they were carefully organizing. One afternoon they met with the photographer inside the beautiful white chapel where the ceremony would take place. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows while sample albums covered a nearby table. The photographer smiled warmly as he reviewed the timeline. After the ceremony, we usually begin with grandparents, then parents, then siblings before moving into the larger family portraits. Ethan quietly interrupted. There will not be a father of the groom portrait. The photographer nodded professionally and made a quick note without asking questions. Claire looked toward Ethan, expecting at least a brief explanation after they left the church. Instead, he immediately began discussing reception music with the wedding coordinator. That evening, Claire drove to Ethan's mother Susan's house to deliver several decorative centerpieces they had finished assembling together. Susan welcomed her inside with her usual warmth, pouring tea before they spread ribbons and floral arrangements across the dining room table. While sorting place cards, Claire carefully chose her words. "Can I ask you something a little personal?" Susan smiled kindly. "Of course." Claire hesitated. "I have noticed that nobody really talks about Ethan's father." Susan's hands paused for only a second before continuing their work. "There is not much to say," she answered quietly. "He chose work over family for many years." Claire nodded politely, yet something about the answer felt incomplete. "Did he ever stop caring about Ethan?" Susan looked down at the ribbon she was tying. "I do not think he stopped caring. He simply stopped being there." The distinction caught Claire's attention immediately. Those were not the same thing. Before she could ask another question, Linda arrived carrying additional wedding decorations. The conversation naturally shifted toward guest lists and rehearsal dinner plans. Still, Claire quietly stored Susan's exact words in her memory. The following Saturday she attended a community charity fundraiser where several longtime Franklin residents gathered to support a local children's literacy program. While helping organize donated books, she happened to meet an elderly couple who recognized Ethan's last name. "You must be marrying Richard's boy," the gentleman said with a cheerful smile. Claire returned the smile. "Yes, I am." His wife looked pleasantly surprised. "Richard must be proud." Claire hesitated. "I think so." The older couple exchanged a quick glance before the woman spoke again. "He always talked about Ethan whenever we saw him volunteering here. Never a conversation passed without him mentioning something his son had accomplished." Claire blinked with quiet surprise. "You know Mr. Bennett?" "For years," the gentleman answered. "One of the finest volunteers this town has. Helped rebuild 3 community playgrounds after the tornado, organized scholarship fundraisers, and repaired half the furniture in this library without accepting a single dollar." Claire listened carefully. None of this sounded like the man she had quietly imagined from Ethan's brief descriptions. Before leaving, she casually asked one final question. Did he ever speak badly about his family? The elderly woman smiled almost sadly. Never. Whenever someone asked why we rarely saw his son, Richard simply said, sometimes love has to wait until people are ready to recognize it. Claire drove home in thoughtful silence. That evening she opened a small storage box containing engagement photographs and family notes collected during months of wedding planning. She realized she possessed dozens of stories about Ethan's childhood told by relatives, neighbors, teachers, and friends. Almost every story ended before his father appeared. It was as though someone had carefully removed one entire chapter from a book while leaving the rest untouched. The more she thought about it, the stranger it became. If Richard truly abandoned his family without regret, why did every person outside the immediate family describe him with kindness and quiet respect? Why had she never heard anyone accuse him of cruelty, selfishness, or anger? Instead they spoke about generosity, patience, and service. Late that night, unable to ignore the growing questions any longer, Claire searched through old family photographs Ethan had stored in several albums. She noticed something unusual. There were surprisingly few pictures showing father and son together after Ethan turned 10 years old. Yet in every photograph that did exist, Richard looked at his son with unmistakable pride. Claire gently closed the album and stared out the window into the quiet darkness. Somewhere between the missing photographs, the unanswered questions, and the kindness of complete strangers, she became certain of one thing. Whatever had happened between father and son, she had only been told one side of the story, and before she promised to build a lifetime with Ethan, she needed to understand the other side as well. The following Monday morning Claire made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of spending another day comparing flower arrangements and confirming catering details, she drove across town to the address she had quietly copied from an old fundraising brochure listing community volunteers. Richard's small brick home stood at the end of a peaceful street lined with mature maple trees whose leaves glowed deep shades of orange and gold beneath the crisp autumn sky. A neatly maintained vegetable garden bordered the front walkway, and several handcrafted wooden birdhouses hung from sturdy oak branches. Nothing about the property suggested neglect or loneliness. Instead, it reflected the quiet care of someone who believed ordinary things deserved attention. Claire remained inside her car for several minutes, wondering whether she was crossing a boundary she had no right to enter. Before she could change her mind, the front door opened. Richard stepped outside carrying a small watering can, noticed her parked along the curb, and offered a polite wave without the slightest sign of surprise. She slowly walked toward him. "Good morning," she said somewhat nervously. "I hope I am not interrupting anything." Richard smiled warmly. "Not at all. You must be Claire." She blinked in surprise. "You remember me?" He nodded gently. "Of course. We met at the charity fundraiser last year. Congratulations on the wedding." His voice carried genuine happiness, free from bitterness or discomfort. That alone unsettled her expectations. She had prepared herself to meet a resentful father eager to criticize his son. Instead she found a man who looked sincerely pleased that Ethan had found someone to love. Richard invited her onto the front porch where two wooden rocking chairs overlooked the quiet neighborhood. He disappeared briefly inside before returning with fresh coffee and homemade oatmeal cookies still warm from the oven. "I bake every Monday," he explained with a small smile. "My neighbors say it keeps me from becoming too serious." Claire laughed softly, grateful for the unexpected warmth. For several minutes they spoke only about ordinary things. Gardening, weather, volunteer projects around Franklin. Richard asked about Claire's work as a pediatric physical therapist and listened with genuine interest while she described helping children recover from injuries. He never once mentioned Ethan unless she did. Finally Claire gathered enough courage to ask the question that had brought her there. "May I ask something personal?" Richard looked at her kindly. "You may ask anything. Whether I answer depends on whether the answer belongs only to me." She nodded respectfully. "Why are you not coming to the wedding?" Richard remained quiet for several seconds, watching a pair of bluebirds land on one of the wooden feeders hanging nearby. Because your future husband asked me not to. Claire expected anger. None came. Does that hurt? She asked softly. Richard smiled with unmistakable sadness but also remarkable peace. Yes. But pain and resentment are not the same thing. Claire lowered her eyes. He believes you chose work instead of him. Richard looked toward the distant hills beyond the neighborhood before answering. I understand why he believes that. Is it true? She asked carefully. Richard slowly shook his head. It is true that I accepted work far from home. It is true that I missed birthdays, school plays, and baseball games. Those facts are real. The reasons behind them belong to a much longer story. Claire waited quietly. Richard did not continue. Instead, he stood and walked into the house. A moment later he returned carrying the beautifully crafted walnut keepsake box Claire had never seen before. He rested it gently on the small table between them but did not open it. Everything your husband deserves to know is inside this box, he said quietly. Letters. Documents. A few things his grandfather wanted him to have. I built it for him many months ago. Claire looked at the polished wood with quiet curiosity. Why have you never given it to him? Richard smiled gently. Because gifts given before someone is ready to receive them often become burdens instead of blessings. She studied his face carefully. Every answer raised another question, yet he never appeared defensive. He spoke with the calm confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. Before leaving, Claire stood beside the porch steps and turned back once more. If Ethan invited you today, she asked, would you come? Richard answered without hesitation. I would be there before the music began. Even after everything. He smiled with the quiet tenderness only a parent could fully understand. Claire, becoming a father taught me something very early. Children sometimes walk away because they believe they know the whole story. Parents keep loving them because they know one day the story may finally be finished. Claire drove away carrying no documents, no dramatic confession, and no accusations against anyone. Yet she left with something far more powerful. For the first time since meeting Ethan, she had encountered a version of the past that was filled not with excuses, but with dignity, patience, and hope. As she reached the end of the quiet street, she glanced into the rearview mirror and saw Richard still standing on the porch beside the unopened walnut box, watching her leave with the calm expression of a man who had spent many years trusting that truth eventually finds its own way home. Claire barely slept after leaving Richard's house. His words continued echoing through her thoughts long after the quiet streets of Franklin disappeared behind her. What unsettled her most was not what he had said. It was everything he had chosen not to say. He never defended himself. He never criticized Ethan. He never blamed Susan for the broken marriage or complained about years of distance. Instead, he protected everyone involved, even when doing so left him standing alone. Claire had spent her career helping frightened children regain confidence after painful injuries. She had learned long ago that people carrying hidden wounds often behave differently from those seeking sympathy. Richard reminded her of those patients. The deepest scars were usually carried with the greatest dignity. The following afternoon she visited Aunt Linda under the simple excuse of delivering finalized wedding programs. After placing the neatly printed booklets on the dining room table, Claire waited until they finished tea before quietly asking, "Can I ask you something that has nothing to do with the wedding?" Linda smiled. "You have been carrying that question since you walked through my front door." Claire nodded. "I met Richard yesterday." Linda slowly lowered her teacup. "Did you?" Claire described the peaceful home, the woodworking shop, the walnut keepsake box, and the kindness she had experienced. She finally admitted, "Nothing about him matches the story I have been hearing." Linda remained silent for several moments before walking into another room. She returned carrying a faded cardboard storage box sealed with an old rubber band. Carefully placing it on the table, she removed several yellowed envelopes tied together with blue ribbon. "These belong to my brother," she whispered. "I never thought anyone would ask to see them." Claire gently unfolded the first letter. Every page was addressed to Ethan. The handwriting was unmistakably Richard's. The date stretched across nearly 8 years. One letter described missing Ethan's first middle school basketball game and promised he would be there for the championship if work allowed. Another celebrated Ethan making the honor roll even though Richard had only learned about it through a teacher's telephone call. One letter contained birthday wishes together with a hand-drawn sketch of a treehouse Richard hoped they would someday finish building together. None of the envelopes showed signs of ever being opened. Claire looked up in confusion. Why were these never mailed? Linda slowly shook her head. They were mailed. Claire frowned. Then how did they end up here? Linda opened another smaller envelope containing several official return notices from the Postal Service. Many carried forwarding errors. Others were marked undeliverable after Susan changed addresses following the divorce. Several letters had simply been returned because no one claimed them. Richard kept every unopened envelope. Not because he stopped writing. Because his words never reached the boy they were meant for. Claire quietly covered her mouth. Linda continued speaking through gentle tears. Richard never missed writing a birthday letter. Never missed Christmas. Never missed Ethan's first day of school. He wrote constantly. Sometimes 2 or 3 letters every month. He believed that one day Ethan would read them all. Claire turned another page and noticed something else. Folded inside one envelope was a money order receipt. Another contained copies of monthly bank transfers. A third included tuition payments sent directly to Ethan's private high school. Every document was carefully organized by year. He kept sending money. Claire asked softly. Linda nodded. Every single month. Even when he was working dangerous construction projects in Colorado and Wyoming. Sometimes he lived inside tiny trailers near job sites because almost every extra dollar came home. Claire remembered Ethan's belief that his father had chosen work instead of family. Suddenly the story looked painfully different. Richard had chosen difficult work because he believed providing for his family was another way of loving them, even while sacrificing his own place in their daily lives. Linda quietly reached beneath the remaining papers and removed one final document. It was a hospital invoice nearly 20 years old. Attached was a receipt marked paid in full together with several insurance denial notices. Susan became seriously ill after the divorce, Linda explained. Her insurance refused to cover an experimental treatment she desperately needed. Richard accepted the out-of-state contract because it paid almost 3 times his normal salary. He never told Ethan why he kept leaving. He did not want his son carrying that burden as a child. Claire stared silently at the papers spread across the table. Every missing year suddenly gained an explanation. Every absence carried a reason no one had ever shared. Does Ethan know any of this? She whispered. Linda slowly wiped away a tear. Richard made me promise never to tell him. He always believed that children should never feel responsible for adult sacrifices. He hoped one day Ethan would judge him kindly without needing the explanation. Claire gently gathered the letters back into their ribbon exactly as she had found them. As she prepared to leave, Linda placed one hand over hers. Truth has a strange way of arriving exactly when people are finally ready to hear it. Driving home beneath the fading afternoon sun, Claire realized she was no longer planning only a wedding. She was carrying the missing chapters of an entire family's history, and with every mile she traveled, one question grew impossible to ignore. How could she promise to build a marriage founded on honesty while allowing the greatest misunderstanding in the life of the man she loved to remain unspoken only days before he said his vows? Claire waited until the evening before bringing the subject back to Ethan. The wedding rehearsal was only 2 days away, and their dining room had disappeared beneath seating charts, handwritten place cards, floral invoices, and carefully organized schedules. Normally those details would have filled the room with excitement. Tonight they felt strangely unimportant. Ethan noticed her unusual silence almost immediately. You have been distracted for days, he said gently as he closed his laptop. Is something wrong with the wedding? Claire looked at him for a long moment before answering. No. I think something may be wrong with the story I have been told. Ethan frowned slightly. What story? She took a slow breath. The story about your father. The warmth disappeared from his expression almost instantly. He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Claire, we have already talked about this. She quietly shook her head. No. You talked. I listened. Now I need you to listen too. Ethan remained silent. Claire carefully removed the blue ribbon bundle of letters from her handbag and placed them gently on the dining room table. He looked down at them without touching them. What are those? Letters your father wrote to you. Ethan answered almost immediately. He never wrote to me. Claire slowly untied the ribbon and spread several envelopes across the table. Each one carried Ethan's name written in Richard's familiar handwriting. Each bore faded postal markings and return labels. Ethan stared at them in disbelief. Where did you get these? From Aunt Linda. Claire spoke softly, never accusing him of anything. She showed me every letter. Every birthday. Every Christmas. Every school year. They were mailed. Many came back unopened after your mother moved. Others were returned because the address changed. He kept every single one. Ethan picked up the oldest envelope with trembling hands. His own name stared back at him from paper that had yellowed with age. He turned it over slowly, noticing the faded postal stamp marked nearly 20 years earlier. This cannot be real, he whispered. Claire reached into her bag again and placed several photocopies beside the letters. Monthly bank transfers. Tuition payments. Money order receipts. Hospital invoices. Insurance denial notices. Richard's signatures appeared on nearly every page. Ethan looked from one document to another without speaking. Claire quietly continued. He accepted those jobs because your mother's treatment was not fully covered. He worked thousands of miles away to pay medical bills and your school tuition. He lived inside construction trailers so more money could come home. He never told you because he believed children should not carry adult burdens. Ethan slowly closed his eyes. No, he whispered. That is not what happened. Claire moved beside him instead of across from him. She gently placed one letter into his hands. Read it. He unfolded the fragile paper carefully. The first sentence was dated on the morning of his 12th birthday. Richard wished him happiness, apologized for missing another celebration, described how proud he felt hearing about Ethan's baseball season through Aunt Linda, and promised that every hour spent away was building something he hoped would one day give his son a better future. The letter ended with one simple sentence. Even when you cannot see me standing beside you, I hope one day you will know I never stopped walking beside your life. Ethan stopped reading. His eyes remained fixed on the page while tears quietly blurred the handwriting. Claire rested one hand gently on his shoulder. He never blamed you, she said softly. He never blamed your mother either. Ethan looked toward the floor. My entire life I believed. His voice faded before he could finish the sentence. Claire nodded. I know. He slowly picked up another document. This time it was the hospital invoice with Richard's payment confirmation attached. Mom never told me about this. Claire answered honestly. Perhaps she wanted to protect you too. Sometimes people hide the truth because they believe it will make life easier. Instead it becomes heavier every year. Silence filled the room. The wedding plans surrounding them suddenly seemed insignificant beside the stack of forgotten years resting on the table. After several minutes Ethan stood abruptly and walked toward the front window. Outside, evening lights glowed across the quiet neighborhood. He remained there with his back turned for a long time before finally speaking. Do you know what hurts the most? Claire quietly shook her head. I remember every birthday he missed. Every empty seat at school. Every promise I thought he broke. I spent years collecting reasons to stop loving him. he slowly turned back toward her, still holding the worn letter in his hand. And all this time, he was collecting letters that never reached me. Claire gently smiled through tears of her own. You still have time, Ethan. He looked down at the invitation list lying beside the wedding schedule. His father's name was nowhere on the page. Without another word, he reached for his telephone, hesitated for only a moment, and searched for a number he had not called in years. His thumb hovered above the screen while his breathing grew noticeably slower. The wedding was now only 48 hours away, and for the first time since proposing to Claire, Ethan realized that the most important conversation of his entire life had not yet taken place. Ethan stared at his telephone for nearly a full minute before finally pressing the call button. Every ring seemed louder than the last. Across town, Richard had just finished locking his workshop for the evening when his mobile phone vibrated inside his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen, saw Ethan's name, and remained completely still for several quiet seconds. During the past 12 years he had imagined this moment more times than he could count, yet when it finally arrived, he found himself smiling instead of trembling. He answered gently. "Hello, Ethan." There was no accusation in his voice. No hesitation. Only warmth. Ethan opened his mouth but no words came. The silence stretched between them until Richard quietly said, "Take your time. I am still here." Those 5 simple words somehow carried everything they had failed to say over the years. Ethan finally spoke. Can I come see you?" Richard looked toward the rocking chair still sitting on his front porch beneath the autumn sky. "Of course," he answered. "You never needed permission." Less than 30 minutes later, Ethan's truck pulled into the driveway. Claire remained inside the passenger seat, gently squeezing his hand before he stepped out. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "tell him the truth." Ethan nodded once before walking slowly toward the front door. Richard was already standing on the porch waiting. Neither man hurried. They simply looked at one another across the short distance separating them. Ethan suddenly realized that his father appeared older than he remembered. More silver filled his hair. Fine lines surrounded his eyes. Yet those same eyes still held the familiar kindness he had spent years refusing to see. "Hello, Dad." The word escaped almost as a whisper. Richard's expression softened immediately. He smiled, not because everything had been repaired, but because after so many years, his son had finally called him what he had always hoped to hear again. "Hello, son." They stood quietly for several moments before Richard opened the screen door. "Come inside." The living room looked exactly as Ethan remembered from childhood. The same bookshelf. The same fireplace. The same family photograph showing a little boy sitting proudly on his father's shoulders beside the unfinished treehouse. Dust had been cleaned away, but memories remained exactly where time had left them. Ethan noticed the handcrafted walnut keepsake box resting carefully on the coffee table. Richard gently placed one hand on it. "I made this for your wedding." Ethan looked at the polished wood before lowering his eyes. "I did not even invite you." Richard answered softly. "No." There was no bitterness attached to the word. Only honesty. Ethan slowly sat down and removed one of the old letters Claire had shown him. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked. Richard leaned back quietly. "Because children should never feel guilty for sacrifices their parents choose to make." Ethan shook his head. "I hated you." Richard nodded gently. "I know. I blamed you for every birthday you missed. I know. I thought work mattered more than I did." Richard remained silent for a moment before answering. "The work never mattered. You did." Ethan could no longer hold back the emotion filling his voice. "Then why did you keep letting me believe it?" Richard looked toward the workshop visible through the back window before answering. "Because every time I thought about explaining, I asked myself one question. Would telling a 12-year-old boy about medical bills, rejected insurance claims, and impossible financial choices make his childhood better? The answer was always no. I kept hoping that when you became a man, life itself would eventually explain what I never could." Ethan quietly covered his face with both hands. Richard walked into the kitchen and returned carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee exactly as he had done countless mornings years before. He placed 1 cup beside his son before sitting across from him. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Ethan looked toward the wedding gift resting between them. "You still finished it?" Richard smiled. "I never stopped believing there would be a wedding someday. Even after I refused to invite you. Especially then." Ethan slowly opened the keepsake box. Inside rested the antique pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather, carefully polished until it gleamed beneath the warm living room light. Beneath it lay every birthday letter Richard had written but never successfully delivered, tied together with the same blue ribbon Claire had seen. At the very bottom rested one final envelope labeled, "To be opened on your wedding day." Ethan looked up through tear-filled eyes. "You trusted that one day I would read these?" Richard nodded. "Hope is sometimes the only inheritance a parent can afford to leave." Ethan carefully closed the box before standing once more. His voice trembled as he finally asked the question that mattered more than anything else. "Dad, I know I cannot erase the years I wasted believing the wrong story. But if it is not too late, would you come to my wedding?" Richard looked at his son for a long moment before smiling with the same quiet warmth that had welcomed every telephone call, every unanswered letter, and every passing year. "I was ready the day you first learned to walk," he said softly. "I have simply been waiting for you to walk back to me ever since." The morning of the wedding arrived beneath a clear Tennessee sky washed in soft shades of blue and gold. Gentle autumn sunlight filtered through towering oak trees surrounding the small white chapel where family and friends had begun gathering hours before the ceremony. The grounds looked exactly as Claire had imagined during months of careful planning. White roses lined the stone pathway leading toward the entrance. Wooden chairs stood in perfect rows across the manicured lawn where the outdoor ceremony would begin before moving inside for the reception. Soft instrumental music drifted through hidden speakers while photographers quietly captured the final preparations. Yet despite the beauty surrounding them, the most meaningful change that morning could not be seen in flowers or decorations. It had taken place inside the hearts of 2 men who had finally chosen truth over pride. Richard arrived early, wearing the navy suit he had purchased several years earlier for an occasion he once feared would never come. He carried the walnut keepsake box carefully beneath one arm, treating it with the same attention he had given while building it board by board inside his workshop. As he stepped onto the church grounds, several relatives turned toward him in visible surprise. Conversations briefly paused before gradually resuming in softer voices. Some smiled warmly. Others looked uncertain, unsure whether they were witnessing reconciliation or simply another misunderstanding waiting to unfold. Richard greeted everyone with the same quiet kindness he had always offered. He shook hands, congratulated distant cousins, complimented the floral arrangements, and thanked volunteers arranging programs near the entrance. Never once did he mention the painful weeks leading to this day. Susan noticed him from across the courtyard while speaking with several bridesmaids. For a long moment she remained completely still before slowly walking toward him. Time had softened many things between them, yet years of unspoken history still lingered quietly beneath the surface. Richard smiled first. "Good morning, Susan." She returned the smile with visible emotion. "I was not sure you would come." Richard glanced toward the chapel doors. "Neither was I until yesterday." Susan lowered her eyes. "I should have said many things a long time ago." Richard gently shook his head. "Today belongs to Ethan and Claire. Let us give them a peaceful beginning." Susan nodded gratefully. No apology could rewrite the past, but kindness still had the power to shape the future. Inside the bridal suite, Claire adjusted the final details of her dress while several close friends helped arrange her veil. Looking through the window, she spotted Richard speaking politely with guests beneath the maple trees. A quiet smile appeared across her face. She knew the wedding photographs would now include one person whose absence would have haunted every memory if the truth had remained hidden. Meanwhile, Ethan stood in a small preparation room beside the sanctuary, nervously adjusting his tie for what felt like the 10th time. His best man noticed his unusual silence. "Cold feet," he joked. Ethan smiled faintly. "No. Just thinking about how much can change in 48 hours. Before anyone could answer, there was a gentle knock on the door. Richard stepped inside. Father and son looked at each other with fresh eyes, no longer separated by years of misunderstanding. Ethan walked forward without hesitation and embraced his father tightly. It was not dramatic. It was not perfect. It simply felt overdue. Richard quietly returned the embrace before straightening Ethan's tie exactly as he had done before school concerts and Little League games many years earlier. "Your grandfather used to tell me that the strongest homes are not built from perfect wood," Richard said softly. "They are built by people willing to repair what has cracked instead of throwing it away." Ethan smiled through tears. "I finally understand what he meant." Moments later the music began. Guests rose together as sunlight poured gently through the chapel windows. Claire entered carrying a bouquet of white roses while Ethan waited near the altar. As she reached him, her eyes briefly found Richard seated proudly in the front row beside Susan. For the first time in decades, the family sat together without invisible walls dividing them. During the ceremony, the pastor spoke about commitment, forgiveness, patience, and the courage to choose love every day. Ethan listened differently than he might have only a week earlier. Every promise now carried deeper meaning because he had finally learned how faithfully his own father had lived those same promises long before this wedding day. After exchanging vows and rings, the newly married couple turned toward their guests as joyful applause filled the chapel. The photographer immediately began organizing family portraits. "Parents of the groom," she called with a cheerful smile. Richard and Susan walked forward together. Ethan instinctively stepped between them before gently placing one hand on each of their shoulders. No one needed to arrange the pose. It happened naturally. The camera captured more than smiling faces that afternoon. It captured the first honest family photograph they had shared in nearly 20 years, one built not upon forgotten pain but upon finally understanding the truth that had patiently waited for all of them. The reception hall glowed with warm golden light as laughter and quiet conversations filled every corner of the beautifully decorated room. Crystal chandeliers reflected softly against polished wooden floors while fresh white roses and autumn greenery decorated each table. The atmosphere felt peaceful in a way no amount of careful planning alone could have created. It came from knowing that something far greater than a wedding had been restored that day. After dinner was served and the newly married couple shared their first dance, the master of ceremonies invited Ethan to say a few words before the evening continued. Ethan stood slowly, holding a folded piece of paper in one hand before quietly placing it back into his jacket pocket. He smiled nervously toward the guests. "I spent several days writing a speech," he began. "Then I realized the only words that mattered were the ones I had spent too many years refusing to say." The room became completely silent. Ethan looked toward the front table where Richard sat beside Susan. His father wore the same gentle smile he had carried throughout the day, never asking for attention and never expecting recognition. Ethan took a slow breath. "Many of you have known me since I was a little boy. Some of you watched me grow into the man standing here today. But there is something I only learned a few days ago, and I believe everyone deserves to hear it because the truth has a way of setting more than one person free." He paused, his eyes resting on his father. "For most of my life I believed my father chose work instead of choosing me. I believed every empty seat at my school events meant I was less important than another construction project somewhere far away. I carried that belief for years until it became part of who I thought I was." Several guests quietly lowered their eyes. Ethan continued. "Then I learned that while I was counting the birthdays he missed, he was counting every birthday he wrote to me. While I believed he had forgotten me, he was sending letters that never reached my hands. While I thought he had abandoned our family, he was working across the country to pay medical bills, tuition, and every opportunity that allowed me to stand here today." The room remained completely still. Ethan looked directly at Richard. Dad, I spent years judging your absence without ever asking why you were absent. That was my greatest mistake. Richard gently shook his head as if trying to spare his son further pain, but Ethan continued. No. Today I want everyone here to know the truth. The man sitting there never stopped loving me. I simply stopped seeing it. Claire quietly reached for Ethan's hand as tears filled the eyes of many guests. Susan wiped her own tears without looking away from Richard. Ethan smiled softly before walking across the room carrying the walnut keepsake box. He stopped beside his father and carefully lifted the antique pocket watch from inside. This belonged to my grandfather, he said. Dad protected it for years because he believed I would be ready someday. He also protected every letter he ever wrote me. Those letters taught me something I wish I had understood much earlier. Love is not always measured by who stands beside you every day. Sometimes it is measured by the sacrifices someone makes when nobody is watching. Ethan carefully embraced his father once again, this time before every family member and friend who had gathered to celebrate the wedding. The applause that followed was not loud because people had been instructed to clap. It rose naturally from hearts that had witnessed something far more meaningful than a reception tradition. After everyone returned to their seats, Richard quietly stood. He held no prepared speech. He simply looked around the room before speaking in the calm voice that had guided him through decades of patience. There is only one gift I wish to leave my son and my new daughter today, he said. Life will give you misunderstandings. It will give you seasons when pride seems easier than forgiveness. During those moments, choose one more conversation before choosing goodbye. Ask one more question before believing the worst. Listen one more time before deciding someone no longer loves you. Families are rarely broken by one terrible moment. They slowly drift apart through unanswered questions. He turned toward Claire with a grateful smile. Thank you for asking the questions that nobody else asked. Claire quietly embraced him while the guests smiled warmly. As the evening drew to a close, the photographer gathered everyone outside beneath the softly illuminated maple trees for one final picture. Richard stood beside Ethan and Claire, Susan beside them, Aunt Linda smiling proudly nearby, and generations of family surrounding them with genuine joy. The photographer counted to 3 before pressing the shutter. Years later that photograph would remain framed above Ethan and Claire's fireplace, not because it captured a perfect wedding, but because it preserved the exact moment one family finally discovered that truth, forgiveness, and unconditional love could restore what time and misunderstanding had almost taken away forever.